Good morning. This morning I want to explore with you a distinguishing feature of our Unitarian Universalist heritage and our approach to religion. For many years now, for at least the last 20 years or so, we proudly proclaim as Unitarian Universalists a strong conviction that to question is the answer. To question is the answer. Most of us would defend this assertion as a doctrine of faith, a way by which we determine our own reasoned position in the grand scheme of things. We're saying that it's good to question the givens that we encounter in our quest for truth and meaning, that each of us should fit and tilt at the windmills of accepted wisdom and beliefs, and that as Unitarian Universalists we have a responsibility to discover and to build our lives upon the truth and meanings that make the most sense to us personally. Questioning the many answers that are out there in the real world is not an easy thing to do. The media spews out tons of information and misinformation and garbage, actually. And there are many dedicated advocates pounding on the desk, on the table, for this answer and that answer. One could spend tons of time, countless hours each day pursuing the validity of a particular assertion. Just turn on CNN or one of the others, or Fox News. It is important, therefore, that we have a more, we design for ourselves a more efficient use of our time and our intellectual energies, and to recognize when a satisfactory and workable answer, a solution to a problem that we're struggling with, has been achieved. To question endlessly is not the answer. Of course, if one goes on and on questioning every answer in sight, there's a high risk of being branded by friends like you and opponents alike as an infernal skeptic. Doubting Thomas, yes, was one of the greatest of the Big 12. But his is a tough act to follow. And I think Jesus loved him nevertheless. From early on, I was heavily involved in social science research relating to issues affecting the well-being of rural people, poor people in many parts of the country and elsewhere, overseas. Each project had to be carefully organized, thoughtfully focused, and prudently justified. There wasn't enough money to do all the kinds of things you wanted to do. Basically, we followed John Dewey's proscriptions for the problem solving. You define the question very carefully. You define the various parameters of the question. You struggle with trying to understand what it's all about, what it is that's perplexing us. And then you search around through the literature. It drives graduate students nuts. And you try to find answers to these questions, these profound questions, and the solution to this problem that you're dealing with. And when you can't find it, you formulate hypotheses, plausible answers to those questions, and you determine why you have any doubts about previous answers. Why are you doing this? Why are you working so hard on this kind of thing? And pretty soon you're sorting these out, and eventually you do a test of your assertions and your hypotheses and this sort of a thing, and then you arrive at some hard-won conclusions. And then there's some other guy, a member of your committee or something like that, that's pounding on you because he says, no, you haven't thought about this or you haven't thought about that. And, oh, look, this guy has already found that answer. He did this before. You're not right, and so on. So it's a long struggle. And in scientific research, as well as in figuring out how best to deal with our own personal problems, financial, familial, work, career, so on, one has to be alert for various things, not just methodological errors or personal bad judgments that we all make that can mess up our conclusions. For instance, correlation alone is not sufficient to prove that A caused B, or that this dumb decision resulted in this nasty disaster in our lives. Generally, we want to find a precipitating cause, something that's really big and that's really driving it, the smoking gun, so to speak. Often we don't find it. unfortunately. We neglect to take into account the context, or contexts are important. Rural, urban, black or white, Germany, Norway, and so on. And we don't want to admit that multiple factors can work in combination to cause the behavior of individuals or the outcome of intervention. We don't want to admit it. Age, gender, ethnicity, education, one circle of friends, and so on. So if you take a lackadaisical approach to problem solving or to doing science, social science, whatever it may be, it can lead to serious misjudgments and more questioning of the answers. And you go nuts answering these questions. You just go on. Somebody questions you, you give an answer, and you find another question, and you go on. And there's nothing firm about much of this unless you make sure that you're doing it correctly, or unless you figure out that you are actually approaching the problem that you're dealing with in your own lives in a manner that has a chance, at least, of succeeding. I did a little literature review. I'm used to this in my field. And a recent issue of the Monitor reports opposing commentaries by two college professors regarding a thing that all of us are interested in, namely the violence that you see in video games. They're in video games. Young people are playing video games that are extremely violent, bang, 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 shooting people down, this sort of a thing. And in fact, the military has been using those video games as a device to get soldiers, I was in the Marines, soldiers really ready to fight for their lives, and mow down people and so on and so forth. Now, the question is whether those video games are causing more gun violence in America. And a lot of us think they are. But anyway, here are these two professors arguing both sides. One professor says, argues very convincingly, that video games may be a determiner of gun violence in America. And there's a good chance of, and there's a lot of evidence that shows this. The other professor, equally well trained in the social sciences and so on, argues that, oh, no, things aren't really getting worse. They've been around here a long time, these kinds of things. And the video games just, this is the word, reflect the society, reflect the culture in which we're operating nowadays. And they're both the same kind of thing. And so you blame culture. It's easy to do that. And the violence that we see and the use of video games have come out of the same kind of a background. It's a violent culture, that kind of a thing. Well, blaming the video industry is simply, this person says, a cultural lag. It's an erroneous use of the term cultural lag, but it's like blaming, in the old days, we used to blame rock and roll for making youngsters too stirred up and crazy acting, that kind of thing, and for irresponsibility of young people. Well, holy smoke, even pros can get causality wrong. Another report that I happened upon notes that most drug use occurs among poor people. And it's because of poverty that people engage in risky behavior, okay, like abusing narcotics. But again, it's likely that there's other factors like racial discrimination and associated mean-spirited conditions that make people feel helpless and deprive them of opportunities. And if you think of it that way, it's another angle to the story. Thus, racial discrimination might explain both poverty and drug use. Think about it. And this is what happens with problem solving in our own lives. Recently I read that, this is true, I really read this, that morality has worsened in America. It's getting bad, it's getting really bad. At the same time, that adherence to Christianity and Christian beliefs has declined. Obviously, according to this article, the latter has caused the former. And therefore, by encouraging Christianity in our schools and elsewhere, like in Texas, wherever they're doing this, we will ensure a return to traditional moral standards. It's a good idea. But one could argue that a growing diversity in America is eroding, weakening the bonds of our restraints against all kinds of things, violence and everything else, and and it's a religion and the social restraints that reinforce moral behavior themselves are all becoming weakened. And so that's really where it comes from. So it's a question we really need to answer. On the other hand, and this is what I'm coming to, is too often we blame culture, whatever that is, or the subcultures, for problems and deviancies in our own society. The gun culture, oh, it's terrible. It's blocking our efforts to get lethal guns out of the hands of the bad guys. Okay? And the youth culture, it's brainwashed our young people. And you young people in there are brainwashed by the drug culture infests our inner cities. And the culture of poverty is a huge generator of many of our social ills. And the culture of poverty idea has been around a long, long time. You've probably all heard it. And as far as I can remember. And strangely, for whatever reason, it is recently being revived in full splendor by Charles Murray in his latest book called Coming Apart. I actually crossed blades with Charles Murray many years ago over his earlier book called The Bell Curve. He's a Harvard guy, Cornell guys cross Harvard guys. Murray now argues that the white underclass is trapped by its own distorted norms, skewed values, and, going back to his earlier work, lessened intellectual capacities, in other words, a subpar intelligence. He really did say that in The Bell Curve. There are a huge bundle of answers in Murray's book. If you don't believe me, read it, the most recent one, that one should question, particularly if you're concerned about helping the poor. Can culture cause poverty? From my experience working with poor families in the hills of eastern Kentucky, I think not. And neither did Oscar Lewis, who coined the phrase culture of poverty, whom I knew. And neither did Michael Harrington, who wrote this famous book called The Other America. Neither of them thought that culture was causing poverty, that it was circumstances that were causing poverty, and a lot of the ills that come out of poverty were responsible for these oppressed circumstances. And it's getting worse. Why is it getting worse? Because we have a heck of a lot more poor people here, and the inequality is enormous in America, just enormous now. It's almost as bad as some third world countries at this moment. Many of the rules of scientific inquiry concerning possibility of multiple causation, making sure that the cause precedes the effect. You won't believe how many times you find that people are arguing that the effect and the cause at the same time. And that doesn't work that way. It shouldn't anyway. Can be usefully applied in assessing the validity of generalizations about societal issues such as those noted here, as well as in solving some of our own day-to-day problems. Now let me shift. The big problems of life, as Reverend Edmund Robinson calls them, tend to be more elusive, less subject to resolution by formalized research procedures or empirical verification. Just like the ordinary sociologists that deal with things that you can solve those kind of problems. And as natural scientists, of course, it's a lot easier. I'll tell you a little anecdote. I had an office where we were working with graduate students one time, and adjoined a very thin office with a chemistry professor. And you could hear what the chemistry professor was telling his graduate students, natural science students. And very far cry from what we were telling our graduate students. We were telling our graduates, it's important to really get into the problem and figure it out. Figure out the questions, in other words, and figure out where they're going, what they are. The chemistry professor would tell his student coming in, he says, you want to do a dissertation? Well, here's the problem. Now you go out and do it, and figure out the methodology for this, and figure out how you're going to use these machinery and all that kind of a thing. In other words, it's a specialized thing. My friend is in physics at Michigan. He is a theoretical physicist, and they separate those from experimental physicists. They're specialized things. One guy figures out the problems, and the other guy figures out the mechanics of working through the tests for those kind of problems. That isn't so in the social sciences and humanities, certainly not in humanities, and certainly it's not the way we do it in normal everyday life. Anyway, those kind of questions can be answered, but the big questions, Even the physics guys can't handle it. We had, in our congregation in East Lansing, we had director of the cyclotron there. He was coming into he's a Unitarian Universalist, and he's fussing with it. When I was a student at Ralph Halverson's church in Ithaca, we had in the same pew, we had Hans Bethe, the famous physicist who worked on the atomic bomb, working in the same pew. They're dealing with big questions. The big questions are too elusive. They're too difficult to deal with. James Still, in his classic novel about Appalachian culture, relates the pleading question that was asked by an Eastern Kentucky mountain preacher of his congregation. And he would point his finger and he'd say, "Where are we going on this river of earth? Where are we going on this river of earth?" And it was the big question. Who are we? What are we doing? What is the meaning of life and our place in the scheme of things? And unfortunately, as far as I know, there are no inherent answers in the universe for us to discover. There are no inherent answers for us to discover. Asking such questions, of course, can cause a heck of a lot of discussion. I remember years ago when I was in grad school, I was conversing with a fellow student. He was a smart guy, economics major, and a very devout Episcopalian. And at one point in our conversation, I said, "Ed, what's the meaning of eternity?" Well, holy geez. We spoke for a long time about this, and he had a lot of weighty answers that came out of his religious background. And eventually I left the building very perplexed. Normally in our casual conversations with friends, relatives, we don't ask such big questions. I steer away from them, right, Liz? You don't ask questions of some of our relatives. You have to be careful. Around here I'm talking about. Next door. And it's not unusual for it to pick up some answers to the big questions in church. Most churches are in the business of providing big answers to the big questions. Back in my Methodist Sunday school years in Brooklyn, they had us reading the answers to the big questions right directly out of the Bible. And I always pondered that. It was just one of the things you did. Reverend Gilbert, whom I read the introduction to, refers to the big questions. He's a great guy. He has good with words. He refers to the big questions as questions that empty the room. Questions that empty the room. You ask good questions and people leave. You know? Obviously, it's rather easy to empty the room by posing theological or ethical questions. That's hard to deal with. Those are very hard to deal with. Most people don't enjoy playing with those kinds of nebulous matters. Reverend Gilbert posits a third kind. He calls it mystical, religious, humanist questions. He calls himself a mystical, religious humanist. At our previous church in East Lansing, Michigan, we had a couple ministers who identified with the same doctrine. And I think it came out of, I'm not sure whether it was the theological schools here that were promoting this. And there was a question about this kind of thing. But I never understood exactly what they meant. Reverend Gilbert, by way of explaining, suggests that a mystical question that would empty a room is, why is there something and not nothing? Why is there something and not nothing? He asked, to me, that's indeed mystical. It's a mystical question that might cause me to smile. Reverend Gilbert's answer to the question is, I don't know. And you don't know either, and neither do I. It's true, the back and forth flow of questioning and answering relative to our concern about the meaning of life and our place in the scheme of things, that we can create a niche of belief that represents who we are and who we want to be. Albert Einstein said it well, quote, "The important thing is not to stop questioning. Curiosity has its own reason for existence. One cannot help but be in awe when he contemplates the mysteries of eternity, of life, of the marvelous structure of reality. It is enough if one tries merely to comprehend a little of this mystery every day. Never lose a holy curiosity. That was Einstein. Einstein had a way with words as well as with numbers. The important thing, he says, is not to stop questioning. I don't want to fuss with Einstein, but I think it's also very, very important to choose your questions wisely and to frame them properly. If you don't do that, you're just going to go on asking a whole bunch of dumb questions. I bet Al would agree, really, Al Einstein. The big questions, the one that Reverend Gilbert calls questions that empty the room, are tough to deal with. It takes a lot of patience, perseverance, and yes, sometimes it may take even an occasional prayer to find some comfortable and useful answers. At our local social group meeting the other evening, we talked a lot about, some of you were in that group, we talked a lot about living a life of inquiry. Remember, Pat? We had a homework assignment choice, and we had opted to read something different. I purchased a book online that I felt I should read, The New Skepticism by Paul Kurtz. Professor Kurtz, maybe some of you knew him. He taught at many schools in New York, Vassar and other places, and he was a professor at sunny Buffalo for a long, long time. Brilliant man, had tons of books. Professor Kurtz, he died in October, by the way, unfortunately. Professor Kurtz taught philosophy at sunny Buffalo, and he was a leader of what's called the skeptical humanism movement. Humanism was very much a part of Unitarian Universalist Association conclaves and movement. But I've been trying to discover, personally, what happened. It's no longer as much a part. I did content analysis of the last two The World issues, and you find that the Unitarian Universalism is shifting. It's shifting away from humanism, which doesn't have the answers, it admits it doesn't have the answers, to someplace looking for, trying to find people and give people things that they can be more sure of. Unitarian Universalism is trying to make sure that you're a little bit more sure of what the answers are to some of the big questions. If you don't believe me, I'll give you my content analysis of the last World, and you can see there are articles on prayer, on using religious language more, and all that kind of. There's nothing wrong with that, but as long as you make sure you understand what's happening, and I've been tempering with that. I tend to be a skeptic on a lot of these things, so I felt that I should read this last of Kurtz's books, but it didn't come in time. So I ended up, I decided I'd get another book out of the Geneva Library, and which I was able to borrow from here. And it had to do with some of these kinds of things. In fact, it's been quoted by many ministers in the Unitarian faith, one of whom is Richard Gilbert, but another one whom I had a great deal of fondness for was Ralph Helverson, who was at the First Church in Ithaca and then became the minister for many years at the First Church in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Helverson wrote a set of meditations called Living in the Question. And this book that I was looking at is by a German poet named Rainer Rilke, called Letters to a Young Poet. There are 10 letters that Rilke includes in this. They were written in 1903, and they seem every bit relevant today, nowadays. And they were written to a young friend, a guy named Franz Kappes, who wanted to be a poet. And Rilke was one of the famous poets of German literature. Franz was asking some big questions about the meaning of life and so on. And in the fourth letter, there is a passage that seems especially relevant to what we've been focusing on here this morning. And you know what? The UU minister in Ithaca titled his book. It's the Living in the Questions. Indeed, Rilke's advice to young Kappes has nudged many UU clergy to encourage their congregants to seek spiritual maturity, not by striving, don't strive for ultimate answers to the great questions, but rather by being able to live with the knowledge that we will never, never find final answers. Thus, we must live in the questions. Let me conclude with Rainer Rilke's advice to Franz Kappas, who's a young guy. He says, be patient toward all that is unsolved in your heart. Try to love the questions themselves. Do not seek the answers which cannot be given, because you would not be able to live them. And the point is to live everything. Live the questions now. Perhaps you will then gradually, without noticing it, live along some distant day into the answers. This is what Richard Gilbert meant. This is what Ralph Helverson meant. This is what Chatham meant, and many Unitarian ministers when they were talking about this, that it's important to live the questions now, and perhaps in some distant day you will live the answers.
Join us for worship every Sunday at 10 a.m. at the Unitarian Universalist Church of Canandaigua, a welcoming congregation. We are located at 3024 Cooley Road, 4 miles west of South Main Street, Canandaigua, just north of the intersection with Routes 5 and 20. Look for the blue signs just before the turn. Your comments about this program or questions about the church are welcome at 585-396-1370 or at our website, www.canandaiguauu.org. Producer and editor, Daniel Brigham.